Hey, hey, hey.
We are live.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome to the Wednesday Deep Dive.
Got a little bit of a late start this time, so.
Yeah, just a couple minutes late, fashionably late.
Right.
But we figured it out. So, for those of you that don't know, my name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here at Wayfarers Christian Church. I'm here with my buddy Noah Randolph.
Hello.
He is our teaching pastor here. I'm trying to get my coffee ready because I need
You need a little bit of a
I need
a
the
boost.
energy to be able to make it through. It's been a long day. It's been a long day today.
Yeah.
It's been a crazy day for a lot of people, I think. So before we just kind of jump into the middle of everything, I think, Noah, you wanted to take a second just to kind of acknowledge a few things and say a little bit of a prayer. So I say we should start with that before we get into anything else.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like a lot of times when you turn on Facebook and sort of look at how things are going in our world and see people resulting to violence to achieve sort of their own political opinions, things can become very hard for you looking at that, and can become really difficult. And for me, at least, it can become a drain on my emotions, and makes me wonder and mourn for how things are going, and really ask the question, like, where are you in this, God? And I oftentimes don't have an answer to that question. I'll be honest. A lot of times you just have to sit in that and really just rest in that he knows what he's doing. But in times like this, I feel like the only answer I really have in moments is to pray, and really just to call out to God and acknowledge that this is not how we want humans to act and behave, but we trust that he will sort things out, and that in the future we hope for better days, and hope for a future in which he is king, and everybody bows the knee to him, and that there won't be any more political or kingdom strife or any type of political arguments and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to pray right now, wherever you're at, and just kind of give you a moment to maybe just close your eyes and think about the fact that there is Lord over all creation that is in charge. I believe that he is king even now, and that he will take care of us even in the middle of sometimes when our country won't. So yeah. Dear God, thank you so much for just your blessings, God. I know that's odd to say in the midst of today, but there are blessings even in the middle of powerful moments of failure as a human population. And I just pray that for us today, God, that you just put a peace on those of us who are really in just this doubt, God, of where we're at as a country, and where we can go from here, God. I know there's a lot of anxiety on both sides, whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I pray that you're just with them, with that anxiety, God, and that you just speak into that, and that you do let them know that simple truth, that you are king ultimately, and that really the main political opinion of Christians is that you are the king over all of us. God, I just pray that you keep the violence to a minimum as best as possible, that not anyone is hurt seriously, and that the conversations that I'm sure will be spawning after this whole day, that you are with those conversations, and that you have a peace in those conversations, and that you bring about some kind of continuity, even some type of community between peoples, and that you'll unite us, not divide us further, God. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. No, I think that's good. I've mentioned several times that we definitely don't want to be the kind of church that just ignores whatever's going on in the world and tries to act like we're living in our own Christian world. So no, it's good to acknowledge things. It's a tough time for a lot of people, and we're just praying that there's brighter times. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Better times ahead. So for those of you that don't know, what we usually do on these Wednesday podcasts, we like to dive a little bit deeper on some of the topics that we've been addressing during our church services. And we will sometimes just address even some tangentially related topics that have something to do with the Sunday service, but take a little bit more time, a little bit more depth to look into. So that's why we call these podcasts the weekly deep dives. But we usually like to take a little break before we go right into the middle of all of the deep talks. And we have been just trying to give you all who are watching and listening the opportunity to get to know us a little bit more and our different guests that we have on, which we're hoping to have a lot more guests on here soon. So, hopefully we can start bringing in a lot of different people, and you'll be able to get to know them a little bit better as well. So this first segment we usually do, the name we've been using is the quirky queries, the weird questions, the fun get to know you questions. And we are just kind of using them to get to know each other a little bit better, and hopefully y'all get to know us a little bit better as well. So, Noah, you said you have one to get us started.
I do. Although this is one that you can't ask me back again, so just know that. But fun. I figure this will be a fun one for all of you. So most of you probably know that Nick has a kid, and I'm curious, what is your favorite story so far to tell about Toby?
Favorite Toby story.
Favorite Toby story.
Interesting. There's so many. It is funny. I talked a little bit in a sermon about how I'm trying not to be that super annoying dad that's like always talking about his kid and always posting about his kid and all that kind of stuff. So if I talked about all of the stories and situations that I found.
Yeah, I feel like you've auto-corrected because I don't think you talk about them as much as you think you do.
I know.
So I wanted to give you the space. Yeah.
So you're like, all right, Nick, you can be a dad here. Show me those pictures in your wallet. Tell me those stories about Toby. What are you thinking? Which, by the way, Toby's usually watching. He watches with Adrian. So probably. Now that I'm on the spot, I'm trying to think. I don't have a funny story necessarily, but the funniest thing he does, which he does a lot, always cracks me up. He has this little bouncer thing that's supposed to help him kind of get more strength in his legs. It hangs from like the top of the doorway, and he kind of bounces up and down on it. It's called a Johnny Jump Up, apparently. I say that, and people are like, "Oh yeah, Johnny Jump Up," but I had literally never heard that term in my life until we bought this contraption. But it's called a Johnny Jump Up. He's got this Johnny Jump Up that he uses to bounce up and down. But it cracks me up whenever he's just done. Like when he's tired of jumping, he will just go like total dead weight limp in it. Like hang there and just kind of swing in the most like depressing, just like he's just sitting there like spinning and swinging in his little Johnny Jump Up. And it's like the most overly dramatic thing ever, where he's just like, I'm done, get me out of here, I'm not gonna hold my weight up anymore, I'm just gonna hang here and just like swing like dead weight on it. And anytime I turn around and I just see him like hanging there spinning, it cracks me up every time. It's super funny. He also he likes to run in it and then just kind of take off and use it like a swing, which is definitely not the intended use of it. But he's got like a little like Superman, Peter Pan flying around kind of thing. We think he's got a little bit of a daredevil streak to him, so I think he's going to be involved in a lot
crime fighting,
a lot more crime fighting. Hopefully no, probably Vigilante. Just a lot of emergency room visits for broken bones that may be in our future as parents.
Oh no.
So
get that health insurance.
yeah So I don't know, it's not a specific story, but that's just really funny. I love when he does that. It's really funny.
When you said that It's funny. There's this Irish song I listen to all the time. It's one of my favorite Irish songs. That's called Johnny Jump Up. And in that one, it's a story about a guy that drinks a very specific type of cider, hard cider, that's called the Johnny Jump Up. And he apparently is resurrected. It's like one of the weirdest songs I've ever heard. It's a beautiful Irish ballad though, so it's great. It's great. So that's all I could think of when you said Johnny Jump Up is the fact that there's a hard cider that has all this lore around it with that song.
Interesting.
So,
all right, I've got a question for you, somewhat related.
Mm-hmm.
What's the worst injury you've ever had, where you've had to go to the emergency room? Have you broken a bone?
Yeah.
What's just the worst injury you've ever had, and what's the story behind that injury?
It's actually a great story. I don't know if I've ever told you this story. So my mom and my sister know this story, but I don't. But I don't think you do. So I was 9 years old, and I biked a lot when I was a kid, and I would bike all up and down neighbors' driveways. Even I was one of those kids that really liked to go fast on a bike, so I would try and go down these. We had all these where we lived in our neighborhood had all these coves and hills that were in this cove, so you could literally go up and down massive hills that curved and did all sorts of fun stuff. So it was fun to be a biker in that kind of time, because you just had free reign of the asphalt that was there. That was a lot. So I would bike a lot, and there was this one hill that was a part of a driveway, or the driveway was on this hill, and it would come down, it would hit the street, and then there was another driveway that went down into a gully. And
so there's a house up on a hill.
So there's a house up on a hill,
and
the
then
street,
a house that's
and
down
then
in
the
a hole.
house down in a hole, basically. Yep. And I made it my routine to go up on the top of that neighbor's driveway, drive down it, and then drive down into the gully of the other neighbor's driveway. In hindsight, I'm is that a cool thing to do? Drive on a bike on someone's
other people's
driveway?
houses?
I don't know, but yeah, that's what I did. But yeah, I would drive up and bike down, and did this 7-8 times, and it was fun. I really enjoyed it. And then I got the bright idea that, okay, I'm tired of doing this. I'm going to go home. And so let me do it one more time, but instead of going down the second driveway that's in the gully, I'm going to turn onto the street, because I need to turn right to go back home, basically. So I go up all the way up to the top of the hill, and I fly down it, probably going 20, 30 miles an hour. And I turn, and the bike goes that way, but I go that way.
So the bike turns, but you do
I
not.
do not turn. And so I end up, I had basically crossed enough of the street to end up falling right before the hole, basically. And so my arm comes down. I don't know if you can see this, but my arm basically comes down. Here's the street, and this is where the street ends, and then this is the gully right here. It comes down like that. And so right then and there, snapped to the bone in half.
Wow.
I will say that it's probably still to this day the most painful experience I've ever had. I did not thankfully have a bone pierced through the skin or anything like that.
Right.
But when I picked it up, it was S-shaped. It was shaped like an S. Yep. Mm-hmm. And the only thing that I howled, and the only thing that alleviated it was putting it up on top of my head, because I guess having it on your head, the pressure is not as much on the bones. I don't know why it worked, but it did. So I put my arm up on my head. That helped. And I told my sister, go home and tell Mom. And so my sister goes to tell Mom, and she was really cute about it. She said she got home to my mother, and my mother told me this bit later. She said, I have some good news and I have some bad news. Granted, she's 6, by the way. I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is I'm okay. The bad news is my Noah's hurt and he's screaming. And so my mother then is thankfully with my grandmother. My grandmother had come down, so they both charge out, and I'm got a broken bone. They take me to the hospital and everything like that. And I'll never forget this. they couldn't take me directly to a hospital. They had to take me to like an urgent medical care. And we get there, and they unload me, and they don't have like whatever anesthesia or whatever it is they need to basically put me under.
Mm-hmm.
So what they end up having to give me is this drug that makes you forget the process, because it's going to be a really painful experience to try and set it. And yeah, so I end up.
So you experience all the pain, but then you just forget that you experienced it.
Exactly. And so I remember being given the drug, and I remember them moving this tower with claws on it, like legitimate metal claws. And I was like, what is going down? And then the next thing I know, I'm waking up. My mother, hands down to this day, says that was the hardest moment of parenting me, because she listened to me, which I have no memory of it, but she listened to me like howling as they're trying to set this bone. And it turned out that they weren't even able to set it entirely. I had to actually go back and have actual anesthesia from a hospital later on because they weren't able to set it all the way. So they got it halfway, and it got put in a splint, and it didn't hurt anymore, and I was able to sent back home. But yeah, it was an ordeal. It was an ordeal.
Like, how old were you?
I was 9.
9.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fun. Yeah, I've never broken a bone. I'm too much of a homebody indoorsman, I like to say.
Yeah, I was way more outdoorsy as a kid than I am now.
I was never, even as a kid, I played video games inside. I was never outside. The nice part about that is you don't ever really break any bones. I do have a crazy injury story, but for the sake of time, I'll save it for next week.
Yeah. We'll come back to that one.
You guys will have to tune in next week. I will just say my worst injury happened playing guitar.
I know exactly what the story is.
If you want to hear that story, you'll have to tune in next week. I'll fill you guys in on my worst injury, which was a rock and roll related injury. Mm-hmm. But you can tune in next week to hear that. I don't want to take up too much of our time this week, because we have a really big topic, an interesting topic. It's actually a continuation of the topic we started on last week, which was related to the existence of, the term we're using is one we've heard from other podcasts, spiritual beings. The existence of other spiritual beings, even in the universe, except just God himself. And that's a controversial thing, a thing that's kind of difficult to explain, a thing that even some Christians don't necessarily believe in. So we felt the need to really make a biblical case for that last week, and we made a biblical case using the Old Testament specifically. And this week we wanted to go into the New Testament case for it a little bit more as well as kind of tying up a few loose ends as are related to that particular topic. But do you want to kind of just give us a quick overview of what we talked about last week, Noah?
Yeah,
do you have kind of quick summary?
So we kind of looked at a lot of the Old Testament last week, and I showed that the concept of angels and demons in the Old Testament is oftentimes referred to as this group called the Elohim, which Elohim means God. So you theoretically could say, though I think it's bad English translation to say this, that there are multiple gods in the Christian idea of Elohim, but we're going to call them spiritual beings because I think that's easier for people to kind of grasp a hold of. And these spiritual beings really have control over specific areas and countries even, where they are allotted to rule by God. And we didn't really touch on this as much. We kind of briefly hit it last week, but I do kind of want to make this point really firmly established here before we begin. But the main thing that we kind of learn from other passages like Job, for instance, there's another passage in Kings, 1 Kings 19, I want to say. I'll go back and check on that one. But these two passages show us that not all of these powers are bad necessarily. Some seem to be serving God, and others seem to be not serving God. And it seems what we didn't talk about was Satan in particular and who Satan really is. And really where we get the word Satan from is in Job, where Job, for most of you that don't know the story, there's 2 chapters at the beginning of Job where God holds a council meeting with a bunch of angels and demons, it looks like, that all are kind of his council. The term in theology for this is his divine council. And it looks like there's a bunch of these sons of God that all hold court and give their reports of how things are going with the countries that they're ruling, basically. And God presides over this council meeting and listens to the reports and says, okay, do this, do this. Basically, he's kind of the leader over this council. And in that story, Satan seems to be one of the sons of God that comes before God. He says, have you seen, God says to Satan, have you seen my servant Job? And then the whole story of Job commences where Satan's like, yeah, but Job's not really a good guy. He's actually would curse you if you took away all the good stuff that he has. The name Satan is actually a Hebrew, well, it's Persian, but also Hebrew name that means the accuser. Mm-hmm. And so from what we understand of Satan, at least, he's the son of God that has the specific role of accusing the people underneath him, which would be humans, really, and accusing them of not following the law of God. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of set all that up as like sort of what we see. I wasn't able to get through all of it in the last episode, so you can go to the Job story and kind of read what Satan's role is in the divine council. But that's going to really matter to what we're talking about today, because the big spoiler is that Jesus comes and breaks Satan's power and breaks this divine council's rule and authority over humanity. And that's the big point we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Yeah, that term of divine council is one that comes up a lot in circles when you're talking about this. It's pulling from the ideas of like a king and his court. There's the king, but then he has all his noblemen and knights and, the king's court, all of the other people that are involved in the court of the king. And these Elohim, or spiritual beings, are part of that divine council. And so we get the clearest picture of this in the beginning of Job, which is a really interesting book because a lot of scholars believe that it's probably the oldest book in the Bible as far as just when it was written. And so it's really cool. It's really interesting to see that just very early glimpse at the understanding of how that heavenly courtroom worked. And I do want to clarify, too, that Satan is a title, not really a name.
Yes.
We use it as a name, but the way the Hebrew word works and all that kind of stuff, it's a title for this particular spiritual being who functions in the role of the accuser. And so that's a term, and then there's other titles like that start to come up in the New Testament where we will see the role that this particular spiritual being, as well as a few others that have rebelled against God, start to play in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So, just like last week, this week, Noah has pulled up a few different verses for us. We're going to be doing another fun Bible drill. So,
get ready.
Sure to pull your Bibles out. Get those fingers ready to flip through. We're going to pull up a few different verses and look specifically at how the New Testament deals with the same concepts of these spiritual beings, and especially we want to focus in on what the New Testament says about what Jesus himself has done in relation to these spiritual beings, how he relates to them. So we'll go through a few different ones, but where do you want to start with us today?
We're going to start with Hebrews chapter 2, and Hebrews is probably the best book that I think unifies both the Old Testament and the New Testament's understanding of different concepts, especially in light. Hebrews is one of the few books in the New Testament that was written to Jews specifically, and so there's a lot more Jewish themes, like what we just went through basically is an entirely Jewish theme of all these sons of God and them being this divine council, really. And all of that comes from Jewish thought. And so having established that in the Old Testament, the writer of Hebrews then launches from that to show us how Jesus fits into all that. So we're going to start with verse 5 of Hebrews chapter 2. And it says, and I'm reading from the NLT if anyone cares, but, and furthermore, it is not angels who will control the future world we are talking about. For in one place the scriptures say, what are mere mortals that you should think of them, or a son of man that you should care for him? Yet for a little while you made them a little lower than the angels, and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them authority over all things. Now when it says all things, it means nothing is left out. But what we have not yet seen, all things put under their authority. But what we do see is Jesus, who for a little while was given a position a little lower than the angels. And because he suffered death for us, he is now crowned with glory and honor. Yes, by God's grace, Jesus tasted death for everyone. God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory. And it was only right that he should make Jesus, through his suffering, a perfect leader, fit to bring them into their salvation. So now Jesus and the ones he makes holy have the same Father. That is why Jesus is not ashamed to call them his brothers and sisters. For he said to God, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you among your assembled people. He also said, I will put my trust in him. That is, I and the children of God, the children God has given me. Because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood. The Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. So there's a lot in that, by the way.
Absolutely.
But I read all of it because you can see exactly why he's bringing up angels here, right? It's not that he's just bringing angels up out of left field, right? He's bringing up angels because in our last episode we showed and kind of left it off as angels have this authority over humanity, right? Like they have this authority to rule over these countries and these areas. But what he says here is that they'll now be the ones crowned with glory and honor. And that's what's going to happen to humanity, is that they were made lower than the angels, a little lower, but now they will be crowned with glory and honor. And that's really where he's arguing that Jesus is now coming into that picture as someone born as a human who dies on the cross, and in that moment of dying on the cross catapults humanity with him to the ruling class, to being the king over all of creation at that moment, essentially.
Yeah. It's a just as a clarifying point too.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought this was interesting because a lot of what we've been talking about has been about trying to find the right terms, the right English terms to talk about a lot of these concepts, and a lot of people start to get really uncomfortable when you call these beings gods.
Yeah.
You know, we like to say, no, there's only one God. And so we'll say, okay, we'll call them spiritual beings. But I think even in this passage, we see another one of these issues, which is using that term angels.
Mm-hmm.
Because angels is an English term that is like a few others in the Bible, which is basically translators having a difficult time figuring out how to translate it, and taking Greek letters, turning them into English letters, and then just turning that into an English word.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Greek word that here is translated angels in Greek is angelos. It's a specific set of Greek letters, and we've changed them into English letters and made a whole new English word that is angels. And so we have a lot of ideas of what angels means. You know, a lot of people have, when we say angels, you might think of specific things. But I think rather than just that process of taking letters from Greek into English and making a new English word, we call that transliteration. Rather than transliteration, I think it's more helpful to translate the concepts themselves, not just the words. The reason I'm bringing this up is that this verse you read, especially starting in the second half of verse 6, verse 7, and verse 8,
Mm-hmm.
the writer of Hebrews is quoting an Old Testament passage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, what is mankind that you are mindful of him, a son of man that you care for him. You made them, as in mankind, a little lower than the angels, which is that Greek word angelos.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to the
Old Testament,
Testament,
which would be Psalm 8, by the way.
Psalm 8, that word is
Elohim. Mm-hmm.
which is the term we've been talking about this whole way through, this spiritual beings term specifically. And so if you're trying to figure out how did we connect the fact that angels are also Elohim.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up.
This is how they did it, because angels is an English version of the Greek word angelos, which is the Greek word for Elohim.
Right.
Spiritual beings.
And that's kind of going back to the point I made earlier. That's kind of why we're saying that, the people in the divine council, these sons of God, are not all bad. They're not all demons.
Yeah.
Some are good, some are bad, and so they both can be categorized as our terms, angel or demon.
Or Elohim.
So,
right.
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So it's a more general term for all of them, and then we will see in the New Testament they start to specify a little bit more.
Yeah.
But anyways, you were saying this passage has a lot in it. And,
it really does.
And we could probably almost spend the whole time
just on this one.
But we want to jump around a little bit more. But what were some other things you wanted to bring up about this passage specifically?
Yeah. So notice that it's through his death that is now what makes him crowned with glory and honor, right? It's the death of Christ that accomplishes this, right? And that is brought even more to the front in Romans 6. And this actually, I think, is the key to unlocking Romans 6. I don't think you're going to understand Romans 6 until you read Hebrews 2. So we're going to go to Romans 6 now, and I will read you that. So we're jumping into a different context here, obviously. In Romans 6, he's now preaching to a group of both Jews and Gentiles. And they're trying to figure out what's like essential to the Christian faith that is going to unify both the Gentile understanding and the Jewish understanding. And Paul has to write a letter to them that summarizes a lot of the Jewish ways of thinking along with a message that makes sense to Gentiles. And so he's constantly, this is why Romans is such a hard book to understand a lot of the time, is he's constantly using Jewish themes but explaining it in a Gentile way. Right. And so you have to know a lot of these Jewish themes going into Romans before you can really unlock a lot of it. So in Romans 6, he's addressing these Greeks who start assuming that grace means that they can just live however they want to. They're saved, they can live the life that they've always wanted to live, and they can just live in sin and not have to worry about anything. In a lot of Christian circles, they call this cheap grace, which is this idea that you can just live your life however you want to. You can sin as much as you want because you're now saved by God, and it doesn't really matter. Jesus died on the cross, paid for your sin. Doesn't matter. And so Paul is addressing Greeks that are coming up with this idea that, oh, yeah, I can just sin all I want now because I'm saved. And he says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we might too walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like this, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like this. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. And I'm going to pause right there because there's a lot already. So his basic argument point thrust here is that you are united to Christ, and everything that Christ went through, you're also going through, right? We're buried with him in baptism, and we're raised again in newness of life. And the whole point that we need to die is to die to the powers of sin, that sin that has enslavement over us, and essentially it has such a strong grip on us that we actually have to die to that before we can then come into the newness of life, is what he says. So he's going to make an argument even further down that if you go through that process of dying to sin, which is Jesus dying on the cross, and if you believe in that, and if you go through that process with Christ dying to sin, then why would you continue to sin after that, right? Because you already died to it. And that's the idea that he's putting forward. And the point that I really want to focus on, not the dying to sin part, the point I really want to focus in on is that the death is in dying, you are, in essence, throwing off the shackles of sin. You are coming out from the powers of sin. You are dying to sin, and that's essentially what you're doing when you become a Christian, really. And in becoming a Christian, you're saying to sin, you no longer have power over me. I'm dying to that old self of me, right? So there's this kind of idea that sin has this power over us before salvation, right? There's this idea that before we become Christians, we are enslaved. We are, in essence, restricted by these powers that sin operates under. And if you read Romans 3, for instance, it says the wages of sin, is death. So taking that and kind of going back to Hebrews 2 again, we see that a lot of the language that he's using about Jesus dying on the cross and breaking the powers of sin is the same language that we see here in Romans 6, right? It's that through dying to your sin, that's what releases you from its shackles, and that's what breaks you. And that's the victory that Jesus had on the cross, is that he did go through sin and then died and then is now resurrected and is born again, right? Does all that make sense, or do I need to say that differently? Because I feel like that's a lot of theology right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a way that we can say that clear, or what do you think?
Well, I think what you're kind of getting at is definitely one of the worldview issues that we have in our culture, and especially when we start trying to read the culture of the Bible a little bit more.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are just logical. It just kind of makes sense to people that live in that world.
Yeah.
That don't necessarily make sense to us sometimes. And so a big part of trying to understand what these biblical writers are saying is just learning to sort of inhabit their world specifically. Yeah. And what we can see from a lot of the way Paul talks is that a lot of this is very obvious, very clear to him, very logical even to the people that he's writing to.
Right.
There's certain things they take for granted, such as their slavery to sin and even to other specific spiritual forces, their need to be freed from that, the way that they can be unified together with Christ, and him dying will also mean that they die. Him resurrecting also means that they resurrect. And there's a lot of connections and all kinds of things that make sense to them in that worldview that we're just going to continue to unpack as we kind of go on in what we're doing. But I think for the sake of the conversation we're having today, what would the connection I want to make, and that we're trying to make a little bit, is what is the connection between that slavery to sin and these Elohim,
right,
spiritual beings that we're talking about specifically?
Okay.
How would you make that connection?
Yeah. So when you think about sin being in control over how you act and how you behave, right? You see that sin is, and even here in this passage, you can see that sin is sort of personified, right? If we're enslaved to sin, then like we're enslaved to something that's like ruling over us, right? That has authority over us. And there's this idea then is that sin represents one of these Elohim, in a sense, one of these ruling authorities that is Lord over us, right? And so that's kind of where you see this link is in Jesus dying to sin, dying to the consequences of sin, the ruling of sin. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about Satan as well, is that Satan actually uses the law to his own advantage. And he is actually accusing people, because that's his name, accuser. Mm-hmm. He's accusing people of not living up to the law of God. Probably the best example of this in literature is the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you have the White Witch who accuses Edmund of breaking the laws of the deep magic that Aslan himself set up. Like, it's not like the White Witch just comes up with an excuse of her own for why Edmund should die. She is accusing Edmund of breaking the laws that Aslan set up himself. And in that role, she operates like the devil would, in the sense that she is looking at Azrael's own law book and says, look, you may have taken Edmund away from me, but Edmund is mine. Like, I own him, because according to your law, he disobeyed you, right? And because he disobeyed you, he's no longer yours, he's mine. And so Aslan actually has to die in place of him to rescue Edmund, right? And that's the story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is beautiful. And that's kind of the concept that's being conveyed here, right? Is that these powers and the evil powers are accusing humanity of sin, right? Of this, of not following the law of God. And when they're right, like they're right. Mm-hmm. And so that means that sin is now also, in this kind of weird way, also ruler over us, because we all sin. And what the writer of Hebrews and Romans is showing us is that Jesus does have to die to remove those consequences that these evil Elohim want to enact on us, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the idea is, if the consequences have been paid for, then you no longer have anything to be accused of.
Right.
So the accuser no longer has anything to hold against you.
Right.
And so there's a lot of different language that gets brought up in the New Testament to talk about these spiritual beings and the role they play in accusing people, mm-hmm. and in keeping people in sin, and all kinds of various different things like that. One of the ones that gets brought up a lot in the New Testament is even this financial metaphor, this idea of like owing somebody a debt, and having the wages of that debt, the wages of sin is death.
Right.
It needs to be paid. This debt needs to be paid. And so, what the sort of mental image we get throughout a lot of the New Testament is this idea of these other spiritual forces kind of holding humans in slavery, holding this debt over people, holding this weight of sin over them specifically.
Yeah, and if you want to see this connection like made even more clear, there's 1 John 3:8 is probably the most clear on this.
Mm-hmm. What's that say?
It says, whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. So you can see that, like, in a way, sin is related to the lordship and authority of the devil. And so when Jesus Christ comes, he destroys sin and the devil in that moment. Does that make sense? You see how those two are kind of related to one another?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different ways we could take it. One of the main points I think both of us wanted to make is a point we've referenced a few times in these podcasts, and I've referenced a few times in the sermon too. But it has a lot to do with how we understand what Jesus did at the crucifixion, how it relates to us, how it relates to the world at large, and how it relates to like our modern world today in comparison to this ancient world that they also lived in. Traditionally, there has been the theology term for all of that is atonement. You know, atonement, sort of that problem of sin. How do we deal with that problem of sin?
Yeah.
You need atonement. Traditionally, if you've been brought up in church, the way that we talk about atonement is in a very specific way, which has a lot to do with we are individuals ourselves who are guilty of breaking God's law. There's a punishment that has to come with that law. Jesus steps in the way, takes that punishment, frees us to not be able to have that, suffer those consequences. The big theology term for viewing atonement that way, they call penal substitutionary atonement. Penal as in like the penal system, the system of judgment for crimes. So it's a law court metaphor. Substitutionary as in Jesus steps in to substitute for us in that atonement. The point we've been making is that is a good way of talking about it. The Bible talks about it that way. But that is not the only way the Bible talks about what Jesus has done.
Right.
And and even the Apostle Paul, that's not the only way he talks about it. He uses lots of other different metaphors. And we realize that there is just a whole bunch of different things that Jesus accomplished on the cross. That's one aspect of it, but there are others that have been brought up at various different points in history. It's really cool. This was one of the very first deep dives we ever did, was on these atonement theories a little bit. And we tried to explain them a little bit, but the one that we are dealing with today is the atonement theory that connects most with these spiritual beings, which is the theology term for it is called the Christus Victor atonement theory. So like the victorious Messiah, the victorious Christ atonement theory. And what this atonement theory does is it focuses just specifically on the way that Jesus conquers these other spiritual beings and forces that have power over people in the world. And the way that he emerges victorious over them and breaks the sort of chains of slavery that these spiritual forces have on the people in the world. And there's a lot of different verses that reference that. If you can, like I've said before, you can just Google Christus Victor and you can find all of the Bible verses that reference that. Your experience might be a lot like mine, where you start Googling it and you start reading all these verses and you just get surprised. You're like, oh wow, this actually is in the Bible. This is totally a thing that is in the Bible, that a part of what Jesus accomplished on the cross was a victory over these other spiritual beings that hold people in slavery.
And the main one is that Hebrews 2 one that I read. That's probably the most foundational to what you're trying to look at, is seeing that Jesus not only not only was a substitute for our sin, but was also conquering our sin in that substitution, is kind of the way that I started to like fit those two together. You know, is that you need to think of sin not just as like something we do, but you need to think of sin as something that we're enslaved to, as like one of these Elohim, right?
Right. And that's the thing that is interesting that you see with the Apostle Paul, is he starts to personify that term of sin and talk about it in the same terms as these spiritual beings are considered.
Right.
And so the reason I wanted to bring a lot of this up too is just because I know that when Christians or just anybody starts talking about these particular issues, a lot of modern people will think this is just some weird, like, ancient,
mystical,
ignorant sheep herder religion kind of stuff, like spirits and demons and, all this kind of stuff. The general feeling is there's no, like, logical thinking modern person that would acknowledge any of these gods any of these angels, any of these demons, whatever term you want to call them. First off, I would question that assumption. I think you can see there's been a lot of just research and studies done that show that really is changing overwhelmingly. Most people, even in the U.S. specifically, believe in some sort of spiritual realm and spiritual beings and supernatural beings and all of that kind of stuff. And that number is actually increasing. There's actually more people that are starting to believe in that stuff than there were before.
Yeah.
So, just statistically speaking, there's probably a lot of you out there, whether you're Christians or not, you do believe in some version of this. The question is, what is that spiritual world like? What are these spiritual beings like? But in case you are one of those people who it's just like, I don't think I believe in any of that kind of stuff. I don't understand how any of that works. I had one suggestion of a good resource that has helped me. I'm the person that could easily lean into that world of just like, I don't know if any of this supernatural stuff exists. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, I find myself personally having to fight against that a lot, having to fight against that tendency to sort of dismiss the existence of any of this kind of stuff. And there is a particular author who's been doing a lot of work in this area that I really, really liked. He was actually a guy that was also on this Bible Project podcast that me and you reference all the time. His name was Dr. Matt Crossman, and he has written a really good book called The Emergence of Sin. This book uses a lot of the most modern understandings of science and of consciousness theory to sort of explain how even a modern person can believe in the
spiritual beings.
Yeah, and maybe in some ways that are a little bit different than what you would think. So if you're the kind of person that's just like, I don't know that I can believe in any of this, I would encourage you just to check this guy out. Noah will link. He's been linking a few things in the show notes.
Do that.
I'll make sure that Noah links at least the interview with Dr. Matt Crossman, and you should check it out, listen to it. I think it would really help you with a lot of that. Specifically, if you are that kind of person who's a little bit skeptical.
I will say, I remember that episode was really dense. So.
It was. It was.
Just be prepared for a brain turner.
You got to pay attention to it. But that might be one way to look at some of these particular issues. If you are that person that just a lot of this talk is just weird to you, and you're just like, I don't even know if I believe in those sorts of supernatural beings. But like I said at the beginning, I think most people are not. Most people acknowledge the existence of something out there.
I think the thing that we're trying to get across today is that these spiritual beings matter in salvation, right? Like this is part of the story of what Jesus did on the cross, is conquering these spiritual beings, right? And in particular, conquering death and sin, both being a part of this spiritual being pantheon, you know? And it is really hard to describe the how, you know? Like, it's really hard to, talk about exactly how that happened. And that's when you really do start to get off into this really dense theology and things like that. So if you still don't understand it, that's fine. A lot of Christians don't. But it is in the Bible, like it's part of what's here. And it is a part of Christian teaching that oftentimes gets overlooked. I think exactly for what you're saying is it's overlooked because it's odd. It's weird. Like, okay, Jesus conquered these mystical, powers that sort of rule over everything. What does that even mean? It is really hard to talk about, but it is here, and we did want to just walk through all of that, particularly in our culture, because I think a lot of times you can see violence and aggression and the ways that people behave as related to spiritual powers. Like, I don't think that it's just only humans are responsible. I think that you can see through some of these passages even that these spiritual powers that are in the world influence how humans behave, and influence cultures to behave a certain way. You can see that back in the Ezekiel 28 passage and the Isaiah 14, it seems as if these spiritual powers have the ability to take a nation and make them more aggressive and more evil even. And so bear in mind that, as much as it's uncomfortable, I do think that there is this element of there being powers in the world that affect how our world is operating right now. And we do need to be aware of those and be comforted by the fact that Jesus died conquering them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so that brings us to kind of a good verse where we can end on, which is actually one that we already referenced last week. We talked about it last week. It's one that I've been referencing a million times. I've referenced it in a few sermons, but I think it really sums up a lot of what we've been talking about. And it's a passage in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 13 specifically. This is, again, the Apostle Paul talking to specific people, and he says, when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. Again, we had this charge, this debt, this legal indebtedness. All of these ideas are brought together that was held against us. And what God did through Christ is he forgave us those sins. He canceled that charge. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. That's what the Apostle Paul says. And then this is the interesting verse 15, and he says, and so, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. And that term powers and authorities is a term that Paul uses all the time. The old King James way is principalities and powers. But he is using terms that have specifically to do with governments and rulers, because, again, Paul understands that these spiritual beings are in charge of a lot of the nations, a lot of the world. And so he's saying they no longer have anything to hold against us. Yeah. Those charges have been taken away, and Jesus on the cross triumphed over them. He's victorious over them.
And specifically, we have a little bit of time, not that much time, but I do want to say that specifically, part of that is letting all of those powers have their way with him. It's in him allowing all of these powers to do their worst on him. And when they do their worst, right, the crucifixion is an awful moment in history. And they throw everything they can at him, even death they throw at him. And they can't conquer him because he rises on the third day. That's really where what it boils down to.
No, and that's a great way to specifically end on and specifically make that point. That is a lot of what you see at the crucifixion, is you see the worst that these spiritual beings can do. You see the corrupt governments, you see a horrible trial that's super unfair, you see violence, you see rioting, you see greed, you see just all of these evil forces all kind of coming together in this one place and in this one moment. And the truth is that after Jesus dies on the cross, it kind of looks like these spiritual beings have won.
It does.
It looks like they have succeeded. And so part of the triumph of the resurrection is that it just completely disarms those spiritual beings. They have done their worst. They've thrown everything they can at Jesus. It is this like Hail Mary, everything that they can possibly do that they're doing. They're completely unloading the cannons on everything that they have on Jesus. And then 3 days later, he's out victorious. And after that, it really does disarm a lot of these powers. You realize, Jesus overcame them. And because of that, so have we.
Yeah.
And so that is really encouraging, and I think probably really timely.
I was thinking about that.
If you start to get discouraged, just understand that this all of the pain and hurt that you see in the world is these spiritual beings trying to do their worst.
Mm.
And we know how the story ends. We know that the worst they can do isn't enough to keep Jesus in the grave, and that we have that same promise of resurrection. And that is a really, really encouraging thing to end on. So
Man.
We'll just kind of end on that. This Sunday, I would love for you guys to tune in to our Sunday streams as well. We got our church service, going to have some awesome worship. Noah is going to be sharing with us, teaching and preaching this Sunday. And we're going to be looking specifically at the Beatitudes and some of Jesus' specific words for how to live our lives. We think that's a good way to start the new year.
Yeah.
Put the old behind us, really focus in on what are the instructions that Jesus has given us as to how to live in this new reality, in this world where he has conquered these other spiritual forces.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage you, tune in. We'd love to see you there. Shout out to all of you that were watching today. I saw a few of you. Shout out to Aaron. Brother Ron was watching. I saw James Burgess. Thanks for all you guys watching. Share it with your friends. Let other people know. We hope it has been edifying and encouraging to you. And we will catch you this Sunday and next week for our following deep dive.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.